The underestimated species, the council chamber of the galactic trade. Federation buzzed with tension as representatives from dozens of species gathered for an emergency session. Ambassador Trilly, an insectoid being with 4 arms and compound eyes, clicked his mandibles in annoyance as he watched the human delegation enter. Commander Elena Vasquez walked with quiet confidence, her uniform crisp and her dark eyes scanning the room with military precision. Behind her, Captain Marcus Chen adjusted his collar nervously, still uncomfortable with the political aspects of his role. For 50 years, humans had been the newest members of the Federation. 50 years of being treated like children by species that had been traveling the stars for millennia. The Alpharii had mastered energy manipulation 10,000 years ago. The Zentari had perfected biotechnology when Earth was still covered in ice. Even the youngest Federation members had been spacefaring for at least 5 centuries before humans had figured out how to leave their solar system. Admiral Kethva, a massive reptilian being with scales that shifted color based on his mood, stood at the central podium. His scales were currently a deep red, indicating extreme agitation. "The situation is dire," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded fleets across the galaxy for centuries. "Long-range sensors have detected the void swarm moving into our sector. They have already consumed 3 systems in the outer rim." A collective shudder ran through the chamber. The void swarm was the stuff of nightmares, a hive-minded species that consumed entire worlds, stripping them of all biological matter before moving on to the next target. They had appeared from dark space 50 years ago, and no military force had been able to stop them for long. Elena raised her hand to speak, but Trilix cut her off with a sharp gesture. "The human colonies are directly in their path," he said, dismissively. "Unfortunately, their primitive defenses will not slow the swarm for even a day. We must evacuate all valuable assets and personnel from human space immediately." The chamber erupted in agreement. Various species began discussing evacuation routes and resource allocation, treating human space like it was already lost. Elena's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. Marcus, however, could not contain himself. "Excuse me," he said, standing up, "but those are our worlds you're talking about abandoning. Over 200 million humans live in those colonies. They're not just assets to be evacuated." A series of clicks and growls filled the chamber as various species expressed their amusement. The Vorthok representative, a being that looked like a floating jellyfish made of crystal, spoke in its melodic voice. "Captain Chen, your species' emotional attachment to territory is admirable but impractical. The swarm has destroyed civilizations that were advanced when your ancestors were still living in caves. Your military consists of ships that are barely faster than light and weapons that would have been outdated in my grandfather's time." Elena stood slowly, her movement causing the chamber to quiet. There was something about the way she carried herself that demanded attention, even from species that considered her primitive. "Ambassador Trilix, Admiral Kethva, honored representatives," she began, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel. "I understand your concerns about human military capabilities. Our ships are indeed newer to space combat. Our weapons are simpler. Our tactics are untested against the swarm." She paused, letting her words sink in. "However, I believe you may be underestimating what humans can do when their survival is at stake. We've faced extinction before, many times in our history. We've always found a way to survive, to adapt, to overcome." Kethva's scales shifted to a patronizing yellow. "Commander Vasquez, Your species' history of tribal warfare hardly compares to galactic military science. The swarm operates with perfect coordination. Their ships are biotechnological marvels that can repair themselves in battle. Their numbers are literally beyond counting. They have consumed civilizations that had millions of years to prepare for war. Then give us the chance to try, Alina replied. Don't evacuate human space. Don't write us off as a lost cause. Give us the resources we need to make a stand. The chamber fell silent. Finally, Trilix spoke, his compound eyes reflecting the chamber's lights. Very well, but we will not risk Federation ships or personnel on a hopeless cause. You will have to face the swarm alone. When you fail, do not expect us to mount a rescue mission. 3 days later, Alina stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, humanity's flagship. The ship was indeed primitive by Federation standards, but it was built with human ingenuity and determination. Captain Marcus Chen occupied the command chair, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to face. Long-range sensors are picking up the swarm's advanced scouts, reported Lieutenant Sarah Park from the tactical station. They'll be in range in approximately 6 hours. Alina nodded, activating the ship's communication system. Throughout human space, every military vessel, every colonial defense platform, every armed civilian ship was listening. This is Commander Vasquez to all human forces. In 6 hours, we face an enemy that has destroyed civilizations across the galaxy. They expect us to run or surrender. They expect us to follow the same patterns as every other species they've encountered. She paused, looking out at the stars that had become humanity's new home. But we're not every other species. We're human. Our ancestors survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and disasters that would have ended other civilizations. We survived because we never gave up, because we could adapt to anything, because we always found a way to turn our weaknesses into strengths. On the bridge, Marcus felt a surge of pride as he listened to Elena's words. She was right. Humanity had always been the underdog, always been underestimated, but they had always found a way to survive. The swarm fights with perfect coordination. Elena continued. They expect their enemies to do the same. They expect logical, predictable military tactics. They expect us to follow the rules of civilized warfare. Her voice hardened. They're about to learn that humans don't always follow the rules. The first wave of swarm scouts entered human space like a dark tide. Their ships were organic nightmares, looking more like massive insects than spacecraft. They moved in perfect formation, each ship knowing exactly where every other ship would be. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Captain Chen watched the tactical display as hundreds of swarm ships approached. Alina, he said quietly, are you sure about this? Alina smiled grimly. Marcus, my grandfather once told me that the best way to win a fight against a stronger opponent is to make them fight your fight, not theirs. The swarm has been winning because everyone fights them the same way. It's time to try something different. The first human ships to engage the swarm did something that no other species had ever done. Instead of forming defensive lines or attack formations, they scattered in all directions. To the swarm's hive mind, it looked like panic, like a complete breakdown of military discipline. They moved to exploit this apparent weakness, but it was a trap. Lieutenant Park watched her sensors as the swarm ships moved to surround the scattered human vessels. They're taking the bait, she reported. Swarm ships are breaking formation to pursue individual human ships. Now, Alina commanded, The scattered human ships suddenly turned and attacked, but not in any pattern the swarm could understand. Each ship seemed to be acting independently, making decisions based on their immediate situation rather than following orders from a central command. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos. The swarm's hive mind had evolved to counter-organized military tactics. It could predict how civilized species would respond to various situations because they always responded logically, efficiently, predictably. But humans weren't being logical or efficient. They were being creative, adaptive, and completely unpredictable. Captain Chen led his squadron in a maneuver that would have been considered suicide by any military academy in the galaxy. He flew directly into the middle of a swarm formation, his ship weaving between enemy vessels like a fighter pilot in an old Earth war. The swarm ships tried to coordinate their fire, but they kept hitting each other as Chun's ship moved in ways that made no tactical sense. "This is insane," his tactical officer, Commander Maria Santos, said as they narrowly avoided collision with a swarm battleship. "We're supposed to be dead by now." "That's exactly why it's working," Chen replied, banking his ship through a gap that existed for less than 2 seconds. "They can't predict what we're going to do because we're not following any logical pattern. We're improvising." Throughout human space, similar scenes were playing out. Human ships were using tactics that had never been seen in galactic warfare. They were ramming enemy vessels, using their own ship's destruction as a weapon. They were fighting in ways that seemed completely chaotic, but were actually carefully planned to exploit the swarm's dependence on coordination. Asterisk. On the observation deck of the Federation Council Station, Admiral Kethfer watched the battle with growing amazement. His scales had shifted to a blue-green color that indicated confusion and grudging respect. "This is not how space combat is supposed to work," he muttered. Beside him, Ambassador Trilix was equally bewildered. "They're not following any established tactical doctrine. It's like they're making it up as they go along." "Maybe that's exactly what they're doing," said a new voice. They turned to see Ambassador Sarah Kim, humanity's representative to the Federation Council. She was a small woman with graying hair, but her eyes held the same determination they had seen in Commander Vasquez. "You've all been studying the swarm for 50 years, trying to find a logical solution to an overwhelming problem. Maybe logic isn't the answer." As the battle continued, it became clear that the humans were not just surviving the swarm's attack, they were winning. The swarm's ships, designed to counter-organize military forces, were struggling to adapt to the chaotic, unpredictable nature of human warfare. For the first time in their expansion across the galaxy, the swarm was being outmaneuvered, but this was only the beginning. Alina knew that the real test was yet to come. The swarm's main force was still approaching, and when it arrived, humanity would face their greatest challenge yet. The question was whether their unconventional tactics would be enough to save not just human space, but the entire galaxy. Asterisk, the human solution. The main swarm fleet arrived like a nightmare made manifest. Ships numbering in the hundreds of thousands emerged from hyperspace, each one a living weapon designed for one purpose: consumption. The organic vessels pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to hypnotize their enemies, and their very presence seemed to drain the light from nearby. Stars. Commander Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the tactical display with grim determination. The human fleet looked pitiful in comparison, barely 3,000 ships against an enemy that seemed to stretch across the entire star system. But Alina had learned something important from the first engagement: the swarm's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. "Commander," Lieutenant Park reported, her voice tight with tension, "the swarm is deploying in standard hive formation. They're moving to surround our forces." Alina nodded. She had expected this. The swarm's hive mind was incredibly efficient, but it was also predictable. They used the same tactics that had worked against every other species they had encountered. But humans were about to show them something they had never seen before. "All ships, this is Commander Vasquez," she broadcast to the human fleet. "Operation Wildfire is now in effect. Remember, we're not trying to win a conventional battle. We're trying to break their ability to think as one mind." Captain Marcus Chen, now commanding a strike force of 50 ships, received the order with a mixture of excitement and terror. Operation Wildfire was Elena's masterpiece, a battle plan that deliberately embraced chaos and unpredictability, instead of trying to match the swarm's coordination. They would use their humanity's greatest asset, their ability to think as individuals. The battle began with the swarm doing exactly what Alina had predicted. Their ships moved in perfect harmony, surrounding the human forces in a maneuver that had destroyed countless civilizations. But as they closed in, the human ships did something unprecedented. They broke apart, not in panic, but in a carefully orchestrated dissolution of traditional military structure. Each ship began operating independently, making decisions based on their immediate situation rather than following orders from a central command. To the swarm's hive mind, it looked like the human forces had completely collapsed. Captain Chen led his squadron in a charge that would have been considered suicide by any military academy in the galaxy. His ships flew directly into the heart of the swarm formation, weaving between enemy vessels with no apparent pattern or coordination. The swarm ships tried to respond, but their perfectly coordinated movements became a liability when faced with truly chaotic opposition. "Target their command nodes," Chen ordered, but his captains were already doing exactly that. They didn't need orders because they could see the same opportunities he could see. Each human ship was like a single neuron in a vast brain, capable of independent thought, while still working toward a common goal. The swarm's hive mind had evolved to counter organized military tactics. It could predict how civilized species would respond because they always responded logically, efficiently, predictably. But humans weren't being logical or efficient. They were being creative, adaptive, and completely unpredictable. Lieutenant Commander David Rodriguez, piloting a small fighter craft, found himself facing a swarm battleship that was 50 times his size. According to every military manual ever written, he should have retreated or called for backup. Instead, he did something that no other species would have attempted. He flew directly into the battleship's docking bay. "Rodriguez, what are you doing?" His wingman, Captain Lisa Wang, called over the radio. "Something stupid," Rodriguez replied, his ship weaving through the organic corridors inside the enemy vessel. "But stupid might be exactly what we need right now." He was right. The swarm battleship's internal defenses were designed to repel boarding parties, not to deal with a fighter craft flying through their corridors at maximum speed. Rodriguez's ship caused massive internal damage before he finally ejected, his fighter's self-destruct sequence turning the battleship into a floating wreck. This kind of sacrifice and ingenuity was happening throughout the battle. Human ships were using tactics that seemed completely insane, but were actually carefully calculated to exploit the swarm's dependence on coordination. They were ramming enemy vessels, using their own ship's destruction as a weapon. They were fighting in ways that seemed completely chaotic, but were actually the product of thousands of years of human military evolution. On the Federation Council station, the alien representatives watched the battle with growing amazement. Admiral Kethfer's scales had shifted to a deep purple, indicating awe and respect. "This is unprecedented," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not just surviving against the swarm, they're winning." Ambassador Trilix was equally stunned. "How is this possible? Their ships are inferior. Their weapons are primitive. Their tactics make no sense." "Maybe that's exactly why it's working," said Ambassador Sarah Kim. "You've all been trying to beat the swarm at their own game, using logic and coordination against a hive mind that has perfected both. The humans are playing a completely different game." The turning point came when Alina implemented the final phase of Operation Wildfire. Instead of trying to destroy the swarm fleet, she focused on something much more subtle, breaking their ability to communicate and coordinate. "All ships, target the bioneural links between enemy vessels," she commanded. "We're not trying to kill them, we're trying to make them individuals." It was a brilliant strategy. The swarm's ships were connected by biological communication networks that allowed them to function as a single organism. But these connections were also vulnerable to disruption. Human ships began targeting the delicate bioneural links with precise weapons fire. Not enough to destroy the enemy vessels, but enough to sever their connections to the hive mind. The result was chaos on a scale the galaxy had never seen. Swarm ships that had operated in perfect harmony for millennia suddenly found themselves alone, unable to coordinate with their neighbors. They began making individual decisions, some retreating, some attacking, some simply floating in space as their artificial intelligence struggled to function without the constant input of the hive mind. Captain Chen watched in amazement as entire squadrons of swarm ships began fighting each other, their individual artificial intelligences making different tactical decisions without the unifying influence of the hive mind. "Alina," he said over the communication system, "I think we've done something incredible here." "We've done something human," Alina replied. "We've shown the galaxy that our greatest strength isn't our technology or our weapons. It's our ability to think as individuals while still working together." The battle continued for 3 more hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The swarm, deprived of their coordination and facing an enemy that refused to follow any logical pattern, began to retreat. For the first time in their expansion, across the galaxy, they had encountered a species that could not only resist them but actually defeat them. In the aftermath, as human ships regrouped and assessed their losses, Alina stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked out at the stars. They had lost nearly half their fleet, but they had saved not just human space, but potentially the entire galaxy. The swarm was retreating. Their expansion halted for the first time in 50 years. Commander Lieutenant Park reported, "We're receiving communications from the Federation Council. They want to speak with you immediately." Alina smiled. She could imagine the conversation that was about to take place. For 50 years, humans had been treated as the junior members of the galactic community. They had been patronized, dismissed, and underestimated. But they had just proven that sometimes the newest species could teach the oldest ones something new. The communication screen flickered to life, showing Admiral Kethfer and the other Federation leaders. But now their expressions were different. Instead of condescension, Alina saw respect. Instead of dismissal, she saw recognition. "Commander Vasquez," Admiral Kethfer said, his scales a deep blue that indicated respect and admiration. "The Federation Council has been discussing your unconventional victory against the swarm. We would like to formally request that humanity take over coordination of galactic defense forces. Alina considered the request for a moment. It was everything humans had wanted since joining the Federation: recognition, respect, and a voice in galactic affairs. But she also understood the responsibility that came with it. "Admiral," she replied, "we accept, but with conditions. We'll organize galactic defenses, but we'll do it our way. We'll train other species in human tactics, but we won't try to make them human. We'll show them that diversity of thought and approach is a strength, not a weakness." In the months that followed, the galaxy learned new ways of thinking about warfare and defense. The rigid, hierarchical military structures that had dominated galactic civilization for millennia began to incorporate human concepts of individual initiative and adaptive tactics. The swarm, faced with an enemy that could not be predicted or countered, retreated to dark space and was never seen again. But the real victory was not military, it was cultural. The galaxy had learned that being different was not the same as being inferior, that new ideas could be more powerful than ancient wisdom, that sometimes the species that had been traveling the stars for the shortest time could teach the oldest civilizations something new. Alina Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the new Human Defense Coordination Center, watching ships from dozens of species practicing the chaotic, unpredictable tactics that had saved the galaxy. They were learning to think like individuals. While working as a team, they were learning to be human. And in that moment, she knew that humanity had not just proven their military supremacy. They had proven something far more important, that the human spirit, with all its chaos and unpredictability, was exactly what the galaxy needed to face an uncertain future. The galaxy had underestimated humanity for 50 years. They would never make that mistake again. Asterisk.